Okay, yeah, whoever started.
I'll start it off. So the country that we have got is Zimbabwe, and let's go to the country introduction straight away. The economy of Zimbabwe is mainly made up of the tertiary industry, which makes up to 60% of the total GDP. In addition to that, Zimbabwe has a population of over 15 million people, and the country covers over 390,000 kilometers of land. Zimbabwe's GDP is $20.5 million as of 2021. It has a GDP per capita of $950. Lastly, Zimbabwe's labor force participation rate is 74.19%, which contributes highly to their GDP.
The inflation that experienced in Zimbabwe is called hyperinflation. In economics, hyperinflation is used to describe a situation where the prices of all goods and services rise uncontrollably over a defined time period. In other words, it is an extremely rapid inflation. So Zimbabwe is a country that experienced significant hyperinflation began at the year of 2007. The Zimbabwean dollar is no longer actively used as it was officially suspended by the government due to rapid hyperinflation. A decade ago, during a financial crisis, Zimbabwe recorded the second highest incidence of hyperinflation in their history. The country's inflation rate for November 2008 was a staggering this amount of percentage, which is essentially a daily inflation rate of 98%. Prices in Zimbabwe nearly double every day, and goods and services would cost twice as much each following day. With the unemployment rate exceeding 70%, economic activity in Zimbabwe virtually shut down and turned the domestic economy into a better economy.
The hyperinflation in Zimbabwe has caused significant impacts on consumers, producers, and the government. Since the prices of goods and services in Zimbabwe nearly doubled every day, consumers could not afford basic necessities. As the prices rise faster than the incomes, poverty increased, the standard of living became lower, and economic activities virtually shut down. Because the hyperinflation is so serious, a foreign currency such as the South African rand, US dollars, and so on, has been used as a medium of exchange instead of the Zimbabwe dollar. As money becomes more and more worthless, their domestic economy has almost turned into a barter economy in which consumers directly exchange goods and services for other goods and services without using any media of exchange. Since the prices are changing every day, producers have to spend time adjusting their prices, which causes many costs on them. The hyperinflation also lowered the confidence level, and banks were unwilling to lend any money, which means that businesses or individuals had no access to credit, which worsened the economy and decreased the GDP due to the lower investment. As for the government, the hyperinflation caused them to receive less tax revenue, as most people have lost their jobs in Zimbabwe, and their unemployment rate has reached 70% during the hyperinflation.
The main cause of hyperinflation was too much increase in money supply, and there are several reasons for this. First, the failure in rent redistribution policy leads to agricultural shortage, and its economy plummeted. The government decided to print more money to stimulate its economy. And second, agricultural shortage brought decrease in output, and the government debt increased. As a response to this, government printed more money to finance it. Third, the government imposed price setting on basic goods to make it affordable, but it actually worsened the shortage as it removed incentives of producers. The The government deal with this by printing more money to give incentives to producers. First, the government rose fees and the investment decreased. So they printed more money to encourage investment of producers. And as the quantity theory of money suggests, increase in money supply increased price level, which leads to the hyperinflation.
So possible policies. Sorry. Okay, possible policies to correct or fix the situation. We can use a contractual monetary policy, which would aim to reduce the money supply within the economy, and this could be done by decreasing bond prices or increasing interest rates, as reducing the money supply and circulation between banks, companies, investors, and allows the government to have like more control of what happens to it. And so this could be done through calling in debts owed to the government or increasing interests paid on bonds so investors will actually be inclined to buy them. We could also help to reduce spending. This in general helps to reduce spending, as with less money in the economy, consumers are inclined to save it and not spend it, meaning that they'll keep more in their wallets, keep more in their savings account. And reducing spending is important during inflation to hold economic growth and in turn inflation. We could also increase minimum reserve requirements. So central banks require a certain proportion of deposits to be reserved whenever it's like deposited. Yeah. And so by increasing this reserve, there's less money banks will be able to lend out to consumers. And if banks are loaning less, that means consumers will borrow less and decrease spending in general. So thank you for listening. Yeah.
Awesome. Well done, team. That's really good. Now, the Zimbabwean economy was an absolute textbook case that is in your textbooks with regards to hyperinflation and what not to do. I really liked what you did there, Kendrick, in particular, where you explained very clearly that they had this problem, so they printed more money. Then they had this problem, so they printed more money. And it just builds on itself. It becomes that spiral, that inflation just builds and builds and builds. And eventually that hyperinflation becomes so difficult to control that, as you correctly pointed out, money was worthless. They went back to a barter economy, and eventually they gave up on their currency essentially entirely. And if you have seen the images online, and trust me, there are a lot of them, and they're really fascinating, just the actual visual impact of some of those images. Like, and the one that's my favorite is that one where it is, and it's $1 trillion note, okay? Because they kept adding zeros onto the banknotes so that people could buy things. And they ended up with a $1 trillion banknote. Now that is obviously in the world of economics teachers, the holy grail, so to speak, to get an actual $1 trillion banknote from Zimbabwe. And it is something I'm keeping my eye on because I would like to put it up on the wall of my classroom, or hang it from the ceiling. The situation in Zimbabwe is like a raging fire, like what we've got obviously in the world at the moment with the pandemic. And the point behind looking at some of these case studies is that your economic policy isn't necessarily going to get you to a solution. So monetary policy, yes, let's increase interest rates, but that's going to lead, as you correctly pointed out, that's going to lead to a decrease in consumption spending. Well, the people don't have any money. They can't afford to live. There's 70% unemployment, and you're going to be less to consume. So what you need to sort of think about then in these sorts of extreme situations isn't the usual textbook answers. So when you're sitting in an interview with university lecturers and they're wanting to know why you want to come to Stanford or Yale or LSE or wherever it is, and they're asking you, here's a case study, what would you do in that sort of situation? If you come out with the sort of the textbook approach, they're going to say, yes, you know your economics quite well, but you don't necessarily know how to push economics, how to jump into a real life, real urgent situation and come out with policies that are drastic. So getting rid of your currency, adopting a whole other currency, that is a drastic thing to do. Other countries that have done something similar, India did a whole demonetization where it got rid of a whole lot of its currency, just said, no, none of that's real anymore, just go away. And dramatic effects from that. But this is something that, you know, if we ever get to the situation of hyperinflation again, then you're likely to see this happening. You're likely to see countries saying, well, our currency, we just can't use it anymore. So whose currency can we use? We're going to use the South African rand. But what if we can't use the South African rand? Maybe the US dollar, but look at what's going on in the US at the moment, you know? So maybe the Chinese yuan, all right? Yeah, good old renminbi. Maybe that's what we need, you know? So drastic policies in drastic situations might actually be called for, right? So it's the idea that you've got a case study where there are very urgent things happening and you need to have very urgent, very immediate sort of situations. Now that was Zimbabwe. That was our favorite friend in economics, that how should we describe him? A bit of a despot, right? Good old Robert Mugabe, who seemed to model his style off of a small wee Austrian man with a tiny little moustache, right? Now, Robert Mugabe was, yeah, some of his policies outside of economic policies were a bit interesting, let's just say that. And if you disagreed with him, then you weren't necessarily going to have a particularly happy time, okay? And a lot of his political opponents, whether they were actual opponents or just imagined ones, well, a number of them disappeared, shall we put it that way, or at the very least, you know, ended up forcefully being told to agree with him. And sometimes that was their family members and friends and everybody as well, all right? So when you've got that level of corruption potentially as well going on, remember, this is the guy, he was in his 90s ruling the country, by the way, right? It's well dead now, yeah? And he decided that living in all the palaces that he was living in, one of the things he decided to do was to set up a reality TV show based around his own family, right? Kind of like the Kardashians, yeah? And instead of the Kardashians, it was Robert Mugabe and friends, you know? Okay, so all sorts of things that you just wouldn't expect to see and are definitely not textbook. All right, so part of this is about critiquing the theory. Part of this is about saying there are situations in the real world where the traditional approach and traditional policies, they break down. All right, they're not necessarily going to work. They're going to work to explain, like using the quantity theory of money, Kendrick. That was really good. That absolutely explained what was happening. Right? But could you then use the money supply as an effective tool to combat hyperinflation? Well, if your currency isn't working, if your banking system isn't working, if people haven't got money to deposit in the banks, let alone to buy goods and services, then yeah, you're going to need some pretty drastic policies involving government spending, potentially, right, in order to drag your economy out of that particular hole that it has created. All right, okay, so that was Zimbabwe. For those of you who are unaware, I'm back. For those of you who are unaware, my better half was actually born in Zimbabwe, just to let you in on that little secret. So, yes. Now, team, and spent part of her life in and around Africa. Now, team, if we move on to our next case study, who did we say we had? We had Venezuela, Yinsen, Max, Joel T, and Sariha.
Yeah, I'll share it. Sariha's not here, so I'll be presenting her thing. Can you see that? Can you see that?
Yes, indeed.
Okay, so obviously we're doing hyperinflation in Venezuela.
So an introduction to Venezuela. Venezuela is a country off the northern coast of South America, and it is a place with a lot of political unrest and civil turmoil. Yeah, next slide. So just to give you some insight and background into the ongoing presidential crisis in Venezuela. On the left, we have Nicolas Maduro. I'm so sorry if I butcher any of their names, but basically he was elected in 2013 to be the president of Venezuela. But in his terms as president, the country has suffered high levels of inequality and also recessions. And because of this, obviously the citizens had protests, and a lot of backlash was experienced by President Nicolas. This led to the man on the right, Juan Guaido, declaring himself as the acting president as of 2019. This obviously wasn't taken well by President Nicolas, and he accused him of being part of a ploy to oust him by the US. And as of today, President Juan Guaido is recognized by about 60 countries and Nicolas Maduro by about 20 countries. The levels of inflation or deflation occurring in the country in Venezuela, with the highest level occurring in March of 2021 and the lowest levels of inflation occurring in September of 2020. Yeah, as you can see, 1 ringgit is worth about 211,000 bolivars. Yeah.
So the impact on like producers and consumers, obviously, since hyperinflation is just inflation that occurred very, very quickly, purchasing power has decreased. So money everywhere has decreased in value. Because of this, prices of goods and services may have gone up, and therefore consumers may hoard goods and services. This can cause food shortages, and as we know, that can determine like not supply, but that can basically mean that they're more scarce, and obviously scarcity increases the price. So consumers stop spending money and the producers have no income. If producers have no income, they have no means of paying their workers or their laborers, so they'll basically let the workers go. Unemployment increases. Government income falls because consumers and producers cannot pay tax. No one working anymore means there's no income tax as well. So this means governments cannot provide public goods or public goods of a good quality. For international countries, this means that investors are less confident and will now sell the country's investments instead of waiting it out because they don't trust the country anymore. And this means like overall GDP decreases. So like as what like Kendrick said just like previously, now they're using in Venezuela they're using like eggs now as like cash, or instead of money.
So the cause of the hyperinflation in Venezuela. So Venezuela mostly depends on its oil export. As you can see, it's 96% of its exports. Back in the days, they were actually pretty rich, so they're able to have really like a lot of social programs. This makes their government spending really high. But in 2014, despite the oil price just dropped drastically, they didn't really cut their government spending. So they start to grow a lot of debts, and when they run out of cash, they just start to print more money, just like how Zimbabwe did. So when they print more money, the value of the money just drops, and they couldn't like pay the debt, and they just don't have enough money. So they just start to print more money, and it just keeps going on. And this is what causes hyperinflation in Venezuela.
So like possible policies to fix or correct the situation is a currency reform. So like money that's undervalued or no longer being used, just take that out of circulation just to like decrease the source of money, decrease the supply of money, therefore the value of money like increases. Yeah, or you could like in that, it's like reduce the money growth rate to like try not to add the zeros onto the end of the notes, because that will obviously further mess things up, as we've seen. Currency substitution is what they were, I think is what is occurring in Venezuela. So this is when another currency is used instead of the local currency, and if the US dollar is being used, it's called dollarization. It's usually, the money is usually from another country which is like more stable than its own. There's two kinds of currency substitutions, partial versus full substitution, and it depends on the situation. So partial is usually only used for international trade, so it's easier for other countries to compare its prices and to trade. Whereas full is they use the money, they completely take out their own local currency and they use the foreign currency for everything. And obviously in both situations, there are different consequences. So obviously if it's a full substitution, we have the country that's taken or adopted the new currency is obviously at the mercy of another person's economy. However, if they do a full substitution, it does make other countries more likely to invest with their own, as they can see the value and they can like accurately like compare it. Another thing they can use is fiscal adjustments, which obviously means just increase the interest rates and like make people pay their debts in order to reduce the money circulating in the economy. Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Awesome, team. Well done. That's really good. Now, Venezuela, again, you see the point of the case studies, you're critiquing the theory, you're looking at these extreme ends of possible situations, but you're also seeing similarities in what's happened, the causes, right? So again, printing money particularly, a big cause with Venezuela's problem. But you also saw in the background that political crisis, which has been ongoing. And the other thing you don't see necessarily, although you do hint at it, is the stability of the region, because you talked about how Venezuela was very wealthy, and Venezuela was seen for quite some time as being a shining star in that particular region, where perhaps there are other issues in other countries occurring as well. So when this actually did hit Venezuela, I mean, they had all the social programs and everything. It was all amazing and wonderful. Part of their response, part of their political response, was to blame other people. And again, you see that same pattern, and students of history in particular will see this pattern, and you don't have to look that far to other countries in the world where this has been what they do, where they say, oh, the election is rigged, or they're all out to get me, or it's a plot by these people, they're conspiring. And the target for Venezuela in this particular case was America. And I'm not saying Americans weren't possibly interfering, all right? We don't know. I have no evidence for that. There is a chance that they would have been, right? Because they have had a history of ever so subtly interfering in other people's elections and economies. But the conspiracy and the political corruption that it led to was pretty drastic. To one extent, one of the former prime ministers, presidents, ended up saying, basically, get out of the country if you're an American business, just leave. And they ended up, by force, taking over businesses and saying, this is now our business, we now run it, you can go away. That sort of an idea. So any help, any outside help, say from America, or even, you know, bodies that are supposed to help, like the World Bank or the development agencies, these were seen to be, again, part of that global conspiracy that Americans are trying to get us, and so on and so forth, which, to be fair, a lot of people at that particular time were starting to wonder about. And there are still people who suggest that America's influence is too high. So should they have been there? Should they have accepted help? Yes, absolutely. But again, it's that blinkered view from the politicians where they say, no, it's a conspiracy, so we're not going to accept help, and we're not going to accept advice either. Even if it's the right advice, we won't accept it. So it's those same ideas that have played out, all right? Now, the currencies that they were choosing to change, to adopt in order to help their economy. Now, the idea was that you correctly pointed out, you're wanting a stable currency. You're wanting one that other countries are going to want to invest in. Well, the most obvious choice was the American currency. But if you've got that philosophy that they're the ones who are causing the problems, are you going to want to use the US currency as your currency within your country? Now, they were kind of stuck, because if you're familiar with the area, there are other countries in South and Latin America that actually have adopted the use of the US dollar. Right? So there aren't necessarily any neighbors that you're going to be able to say, oh, they're stronger. Like, say, in Zimbabwe's case with South Africa, we'll use their currency. Okay, so what would you do? Well, would you then take the Chinese yuan? You know, I mean, there's a whole range of political issues with all of those sorts of options. The other thing that was interesting to note, well, there's a couple other things interesting to note about Venezuela. It's an ongoing crisis, right? It's still happening now. There were such shortages, and you may have seen this, if you went through that video in the worksheet, you may have seen this, that such shortages that they ran out of pretty much everything, but they did have things like rotten meat. So in the markets, you'd go to buy your meat, food, and the only thing that would be available would be rotten meat. So the example of inferior goods comes in then, because that's all you have, right? So you buy the rotten meat, because if not, you're going to starve, right? You talked about the moving to a barter-based system, and again, we've seen that. We saw that in the Zimbabwe approach as well. It's the idea where you're in these sorts of extreme situations where it's not a handful of people, it's almost the entire economy moves from being a formal market-based system into an informal, even underground system, where there is perhaps rampant corruption and massive price gouging and scarcities and auctions and all sorts of other illegal activities going on, because there's no regulation, there's nothing to control that. So all of those sorts of infrastructure things fall apart, the rule of law falls apart. And those are things that then have implications with confidence, as you mentioned, and international investment, international aid, all of that. But again, if you are blocking that because you think that there's conspiracies, etc., at work, then you're not going to accept those either. Something also to be aware of is that there actually is an international school in Venezuela, right, that was attempting to operate at that time, rather unsuccessfully. They ended up paying their teachers in US dollars because there was no point in paying them in Venezuelan bolivars. Yeah? So these sorts of situations have collateral damage that then spilled out. So the region around Venezuela was also affected, and Colombia, I'm fairly certain, experienced a mass migration of people from Venezuela. They just got up and left. There's no jobs, there's no incomes, I can't afford to feed my family, there's no food anywhere. So they all walked, and there were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them, and they would walk across the border every day to go into Colombia to try desperately hard to find food, and then to try and take it back to their families. Or they just uproot their entire family and just go and leave Venezuela just straight for Colombia and try desperately to live there. And one of the things that in economics we recognize is it's those people then that you might have needed in your economy. So you're losing the skill base, the productivity of those people, they're gone, and then what you have left is people who are too sick to travel or too young to travel or whatever, and you don't have the productive resources left in order to help rebuild your economy. So it just keeps going. So you need that political will at the top with international support in order to try and sort that particular problem out. So again, it's not a textbook case of just use monetary policy or just use fiscal policy. There's got to be, or you almost have to strip the entire economy away and start all over again. It's basically that desperate. You know, that's the sort of situation that you've got. All right, ladies and gentlemen, now what we're going to do, because we've still got the deflation team, which is Japan, and the Weimar Republic team. right? And I would encourage you to, those of you who've done, obviously, the Zimbabwe and the Venezuela, you know, do have a look through their material, right? Because it is good. And the recording from their presentation I'll upload at some point when it's, you know, processed, right? So that will be available to you to review as well. But we will see the deflation and we will see the Weimar Republic tomorrow, hopefully. That they will be very interesting, and they will complete our roundup of hyperinflation and deflation and case studies where we get to see what the impact of these particular situations. Right. Otherwise, team, you've got an IAC2 to be working on and some other revision potentially to do. Yes, you can share the presentations with everybody. They should be in that doc. So they should be available to everybody through the doc that had the task in it as well. Right. Otherwise, as we say in the land of my birth, hey korneda, which means goodbye for now.
Bye, sir. Thank you.
Bye, David. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Sir, I have a question about
Hold on
the
a
IA.
second. Yeah, hold on a second.
So,
Okay. This button here, hold on.